Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You know, last week on the show, we talked about relationships and the dichotomies in the Myers-Briggs system. So that four-letter code, like for example, I'm an ENFP, the four letters, those are each representing one dichotomy. So I'm E, the opposite of that would be I. I'm N, the opposite would be S. I'm F, opposite T, and P, opposite J. And we talked about how people show up when they are in relationship with people of opposite dichotomy to them, and then the same dichotomy. We went through each one on the last show. And that's very useful, I think, to understand how you're going to show up to the world in basic understanding of the Myers-Briggs system. However, today, we want to go a little deeper. That four-letter code is actually to tell you the wiring of your mind. And this is called technically cognitive functions. It's the way that you learn or perceive information or look at the world, and also the way that you make decisions based on what you see and the should statements we bring out in life. So what happens is when you have that four-letter code, that tells you which cognitive functions you're using as your preference as you move through life. And I think that's really helpful when we start to go down to this layer. Now we're not just talking about the dichotomies and we're not talking about behavior. We're talking about actually how your mind works and the partner or person you're in a relationship with, how their mind is working. And often if you can understand this really gives you a sense of how the person that you're in love with is thinking, and they can understand how you're thinking. And that can help get through a lot of conflict. It can help find a lot of common ground, and there's a lot of play and intimacy that can come from that understanding as well.
Yeah. It's difficult in an hour podcast to break down every single type and cognitive function and the relationship between the two. So we're actually not going to do a side-by-side comparison of all of the cognitive functions and how they relate in a relationship, because that would just be literally too much content for a podcast. Our recommendation, though, is if you have not done so yet, once you know your type, figure out what your cognitive function stack is. And if you go to the website, if you haven't done this yet, go to the website, personalityhacker.com, put in car model in the search field, and it will tell you what, like a basic way to understand these cognitive functions as they relate to passengers in a car. And the general feel or the general sentiment is that you have four parts of you that influence you more than anything else. Two parts that are quite strong or can be quite strong and big influencers in your personality based on talent and then skill you build over time. And then two parts that are not as strong and maybe are blind spots or influence you in ways that are less mature. And none of these parts are necessarily good or bad by definition. They're strengths and weaknesses. And understanding how the passengers in your car or your cognitive function stack relates to your type is a pretty big leverage point. But for the sake of this particular podcast, what we recommend doing is once you know your cognitive function stack or the passengers in your car, and there's also some reference guides on the site too that tell you what the cognitive function stack or each of the cognitive functions is for every single all 16 Myers-Briggs types. Once you figure that out, then do the same for your spouse or your mate. And then have the two side by side, one, your car model and their car model side by side. And that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to assume you've already done that. So if you have not done that yet, then my recommendation is after you listen to this podcast, or maybe even hit pause right now, and go have those two car diagrams for each of your types sitting side by side. And then once you have those, we're going to talk about some overarching principles that you can be looking out for and some of the things that might trip you up as a couple based on your two car diagrams or car models.
Yeah, and I think so let's dive right into that driver process. This is the process, the mental process, cognitive function, that is your favorite way of showing up to the world. And often this is a very unconscious process for you. You've been using it your whole life, and your spouse or lover has been using their version of this their whole life, this driver process. So it's something that you're not necessarily working in the realm of, oh, I'm totally aware of when this is showing up for me, because it's something you just are automatically doing. Now, here's, I think, where the conflict can happen at the driver process level. If you are married to somebody or in relation to somebody that is either helping contribute to you turning that off or helping get that suppressed or deliberately trying to suppress that, that is going to cause conflict. You might deal with it in various ways. It might be depression, it might be anger, it might be withdrawal, it might be hostility, whatever your version of angst or like withdrawal or downward energy is. That's how it's going to probably show up if you feel like your spouse or lover is not allowing you to access that on enough regular basis, because this is something that puts you into flow. You feel great using this mental process. And if you are restricted from that, that is not sustainable at all. You cannot sustain being restricted from using that primary function. So I think that's the first thing to pay attention to is, am I in this relationship and is my lover in this relationship or spouse able to access and fully embody and be in that driving process?
Yeah. Well, and usually what happens is it's not so much that the other person is trying to oppress what they don't understand. It's that they don't understand it, and so therefore it gets marginalized or punished in some way. And we do it to each other.
Yeah, there's not a lot of intent here, usually.
Exactly. It's that they don't really understand why you would go about the world the way that you do. They don't understand how you see the world. That doesn't really make sense to them if they're not using the same process. And so because of that, it's really easy to go, well, that's not how that works, or that's stupid, or like, wait, what, why does that matter to you? It's mostly, it's a clumsiness as opposed to, like you said, an ill intent. So both people in a relationship, if they enjoy going down this road, of greater self and other understanding, really getting very clear on what your dominant process or driver process is, and getting super clear on what your spouse's or mate's driver process is, and then just having a conversation around it. How does this show up for me? Like, how do I see this showing up in my life? And like Joel mentioned, these are unconscious processes to some extent because you're so unconsciously competent at them. They're just the way that you show up to the world. But then getting some more, sort of detail on what that means is really powerful for being able to communicate. Like, you and I are fortunate that we have the same dominant process or driver process. We both use extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. So both of us understand that need to get out and go do something if we've been cooped up for too long. We both understand the need to just like randomly drive to Florida one day because we just have to. We can't even like just go. Let's just get out of here.
Yeah.
We sympathize. But if I was married to somebody who didn't get that, when I had that impulse, they'd be like, we can't go do that. Why would you want to do that? Like, you're just being irresponsible. And then I might feel like they didn't get me, or I was being marginalized. So if you don't fully understand that driver process for yourself and for each other, you can unconsciously punish each other for something that is completely natural to each other. The other thing to look out for when you're doing a side-by-side comparison of each other's dominant or driver process is determining whether or not you're leading with what's called a perceiving, or what we call an understanding process, or a decision-making or judging process. Now, if your driver or dominant process is intuitive or sensory, and there's, different flavors of each, but if it's intuitive or a sensory process, that means you're leading with something that's called a perceiving process, or what helps you basically, what's going to get your attention in the world, what's interesting to you, how you're going to process information, kind of understand how things work. And if you are leading with a thinking or a feeling process, and again, there's different flavors of each, that's what's called a judging process, or we also call it decision making. This is where you show up with should statements about how things should be in the world. If one of you has a perceiving process as a driver and the other one has a judging process as a driver, this can create some I don't want to say some problems. It's more like a
tension points.
Yeah, there's like a tension point, or almost maybe an imbalance to some extent. Because the person who's leading with the perceiving process is not, like, they're not entering the world making decisions about how things should be. They're entering a world more like open and curious and waiting to see how things pan out. So they have a tendency to pause more, even if they're an extrovert and they get into action quick. Before they come to a conclusion about something, they tend to hesitate. Whereas a person who's leading with a decision-making or a judging process as a driver is more likely to assert their opinion about how things should be in the world. They're more likely to lead with a should mentality. Like, well, that's not how that should be, or that's how that should be. And so in decision-making realm, which a lot of relationship is trying to figure out how to navigate around mutual decisions. That's like a big piece of relationships. Like, how should we be living our life? Should we be having children? Should we buy a house or should we rent? Should we go on vacation? What should our jobs be? Like, lots of a relationship is basically boiled down to, are we agreeing on the decisions we're making?
Yeah.
And if one person shows up as being more decisive than the other, the person who's leading with that perceiving process might feel like they're being bowled over a lot, or that they don't really get as much of a say because the other person seems so certain about their opinions, or they're really like, this is something that's super important to them. And to the person who's leading with an intuitive or sensory process, they're like, well, I guess I don't care that much, so it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But then when they care, now it turns into a huge battle because the person who's leading with the judging process isn't used to having a fight. They're used to just kind of being able to take over. The other piece of it is, on the other side, the person leading with the judging process might see the other person as not pulling their weight. Like, all the decisions have to fall on this person who's leading with the judging process. And that's even if that person is a perceiver. Like, they could be leading with introverted thinking or introverted feeling. But they still may feel like the other person's handing decision-making power over to them, or they're not making decisions fast enough. Like, I don't understand why we have to drag our feet all the time. And so that might create a little bit of imbalance in the relationship, but it's not that it's a deal breaker. It's just be aware of it. Now, if you have two people leading with judging processes, that could turn into a lot of friction. You have two people who are very certain about how things should be, so you have a lot of fights. And if two people are leading with perceiving processes, like you and I are, Joel, we both have an intuitive process as our dominant or driver. We have a tendency to move very slowly on everything because we don't have a sense of certainty. We look to each other like, what do you think? I don't know. What do you think? And it takes us a long time to figure out what it is that we fundamentally want. So there's going to be, there's like a trickiness here, and it's mostly about being aware of it, understanding how you operate and how the other person operates, and then creating a conversation around that.
Yeah, and I think, we just went really quickly through that. So if you're like, wait a minute, back up, perceiving functions, judging, what in the world are you guys talking about? Again, if you go to personalhacker.com and look at the car model, this will give you a little bit more framework if you can look at the two car models side by side. But let me just give you, from what we talked about last week, remember we talked about the dichotomies. So let's say that I was married to, or I was in a relationship with an ENFJ woman instead of you, Antonia, or let's say you were an ENFJ. Both of us are extroverts. Both of us are intuitive. Both of us would be feelers. But there'd be the difference between the J and the P. And that's very key because when we look at the cognitive functions now, that ENFJ would be leading with a decision-making function, extroverted feeling, and I'm leading with a perceiving function, extroverted intuition. And so that's where understanding the cognitive functions, you start to realize that, oh yeah, they're both extroverts, they're both intuitives, they're both feelers. They should get along great. I mean, they'll have a little judger-perceiver tussle, but it's more than just the organization part of judger-perceiver. We're actually showing up with our drivers very different. The ENFJ is showing up with a decision-making function driver, and I'm showing up with a perceiving function driver. And so that's what Antonia is talking about, is there's a difference there in the mental wiring of where you're showing up primarily. All the dichotomies could be very similar or very close to each other. And yet there's such a difference in how you're approaching the world and the quickness you make decisions and what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of how that can play out, where on paper it all looks like everything should work together, but then it's like, we're still having conflict. Why is this happening? It's because of the cognitive functions. That's why. At that level, you start to see the differences and the connection points and how things can play out for you.
Yeah, well, and in your particular example, that's actually a really good example. Because if you take it one step further and understand the implications of some of what that might mean, if a woman is an ENFJ and she's leading with a decision-making process, and you as a man are an ENFP and you're leading with a understanding or perceiving process, and she feels like she's having to take the lead in a lot of decisions,
especially around social situations.
That's right. And if she's using extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, which is very in touch with how society sees things as they should be, there might be kind of a sense of like, well, why isn't he stepping up? Why is he handing me all of this? Like, I don't really feel like I can rest into him if he's just, like if he's handing all these decisions over to me and I'm the person who has to be decisive all the time. Like, what's going on? Is he not stepping into his his masculine self? There could be some doubt that enters into a relationship like that. So And that could be, I mean, that's just like one example of how one thing can pan out in one way. There's a million variants depending upon what kind of relationship you have. We speak in terms of, primarily heterosexual relationships, but all of these can flay out to same-sex and to, polyandrous relationships and all sorts of things. So, your particular situation is going to be a little different, but think about those kinds of things. When you see your car model side by side and you go, okay, so what are some of the assumptions that I make about the relationship I'm in and how it's supposed to look based on, the culture that I'm in? And when I'm looking at what my dominant driver process is and what their dominant driver process is, where can it go wrong? How is this something that could maybe manifest in some of the fights that we're having or arguments or tension? Because this could be a source, just understanding this could be a source of maybe pulling away from some of those arguments and going, maybe we should just understand what's going on here a little bit better.
Yeah. So let's move on to that second position. It's the Copilot, if you're looking at the car model, or if you're looking at cognitive function stack, it's just the second position down. And this is going to be, we call it here at Personality Hacker, your growth state. We feel it's the highest leverage part of your personality to focus on. Put disciplined training around exercises and growing that process to show up as the best version of yourself. This too is a process that you naturally use. This is a complement to your driver process. Now, this is a little more conscious for you. And what ends up happening often, this is going to be something that, and there's a lot of reasons for this that we've talked about in tons of other episodes, but this is one that you may skip past sometimes in your personality. When you're either looking to gain new insight or information or make a decision, depending on what function is in this position, often you can just kind of skip past this and go down to that 10-year-old or tertiary position for help in this situation. And so sometimes in a relationship, one person is focused on either knowingly or unknowingly growing that growth state position, and the other person unknowingly or knowingly is not growing in that way. And if one person in a relationship is focused on growth and working on their personality to grow themselves, and the other person's not, you're either growing together or growing apart in a lot of ways. So if you've been listening to us for a while, you've heard us beat into your brain and our own brains, because we need to hear this too, that second position, that Copilot position in your cognitive function stack is so critical for your personal growth journey. It's one of the best places to start personal growth because it gives you the reserves and all of the training that you need to start down a path of really scaling up in your life. And if you've taken our advice and you're doing that and your lover or spouse isn't, that can cause conflict because now you've focused on growth in that area and they may not have, and that can start to cause some pull away. So that's just one thing that I'll talk about. If you've been a long-time listener and you've been growing, you might actually, as you're growing, you're like, things should be getting better in my life. And oftentimes they get destabilized because you're changing the dynamic that people are used to interacting with you on. So that's just one thing to watch out for in a relationship. As you're down this growth path and your spouse may not be either understanding, interested, or just unaware of what they could be doing on their end, that can cause some rifts and conflicts.
Let me give you an example of what I think you're talking about, Joel.
Sure.
So you and I have both done a lot of very conscientious work on that auxiliary or Copilot process. And for you, and I'm going to say this as an observer, not to pick on you, but just to mention some observations. You've been working on your Copilot or auxiliary process of introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And introverted feeling is it's a tough one to work on because it requires you to be very in touch with things that could be quite unpleasant, like emotional experiences, a lot of introspection around things that, like you might not feel good about in the moment. And it's about working through it and understanding, like a lot of self-forgiveness, a lot of self-acceptance, a lot of, coming to terms with, the reality of things as they are. But it also means regulating and doing a lot of personal, emotional Aikido on yourself. There was a time period where you were just all in and you were almost like a bull in a china shop in this scenario because you were so in your emotional state, which you had been avoiding for a while. You had, because there was a lot of pain there. There was a lot of things to come to terms with, a lot of things around your ego that you weren't ready to deal with because you had some healing work to do. And so when you were getting into that process, it looked really unstable from the outside.
Very messy.
Yeah, it just looked messy. But it was the growth process. It was the thing you had to do. And I had a version of this myself. Like when I went into my auxiliary process of introverted thinking or accuracy, like I left a mushroom cloud behind me of just complete and total destruction of like, oh, my entire life is a lie. And I'm now going to have to remove myself from that. So I did a very similar thing. It was incredibly destabilizing. And lots of people felt like I hurt them very badly. And the same thing for you. Lots of people felt like you were hurting them because we had to get through like the parts that we were avoiding because we knew there was a mess. We knew there was a mess, so we just kept closing the door on that. And when we finally went, nope, I'm going to open the door and I'm going to walk in and I'm going to start cleaning up this room, it was overwhelming and it looked worse. It was worse before it got better. But then once we got to the other side of those, like there was a level of emotional aikido that you have currently tapped into that I just stand in awe around. Like it's kind of amazing. But at first it wasn't. It was messy. So if you're working on your auxiliary process or Copilot process and things feel like they're getting worse instead of better, that's not uncommon, especially if this is one of your first forays into really doing this. Because when we first pick up you might have a talent there, but when you first pick up a skill, it gets kind of messy at first. Like you don't look like you're doing that good of a job because it's relatively new getting into these more advanced components of that process. So if you're in that state and your mate is looking at you going like, what are you doing? This is not the person I married, or this is not who I know. And you're like, yeah, but I'm doing it for growth. Stay the course. It gets better. The way out is through. You're going to be fine. But in the meantime, it is kind of difficult to, communicate the process as it's happening. And that can happen when two people have different Copilot processes. Even if they're working on them at the same time, it can still get messy. Even if all of this is super conscious and you've talked about it and you have a plan, like Joel and I did, it still got messy. So that's one of the ways that knowing each other's auxiliary process or Copilot process can be very helpful in weathering that storm when you're really working on it and things feel a little destabilized.
Yeah, I think giving each other grace and space there is really important, and helping your lover or spouse, the person you're in a relationship with, understand what's going on for you. Like, hey, I'm not doing this to be destabilizing. I know it can be a little crazy here, and some of these growth places are not as destabilizing as mine was. I don't think that's always the case for you. I think, but it can be, and it's often happening for people that we talk with and coach and around. When they start growing, it's something that you have so many internal resistances for. And now your spouse or lover is also giving you resistance, or maybe like, I don't like this about you. And that can be tough to fight yourself and fight the outside world, to grow yourself in that. And you feel like you're just messing up and things are all over the place, like a crazy man, like what's going on here? Hang in there and continue the course. And I think with good intention, positivity, and the willingness and a good attitude to say, hey, yeah, I messed up there. Sorry about that. But just keep going. I think you're going to see a lot of great results at the end of that journey. And results may vary and timelines may vary, but I do believe it's a positive uptick for you.
One of the things you can do here is really get clear on the needs of your Copilot. Like, what does it need? Like for me, I'm an extrovert, so my Copilot auxiliary process is introverted. That means I have to have high quality introverted time, and I don't always acknowledge that. But I know that process needs it. So as I go on my growth journey, I know that I have to have that space, and I just have to carve it out. So I communicate to the people around me, hey, I'm going to need some alone time. Usually I try to get up earlier than everybody else, and I go play video games for a while. And I know that probably doesn't sound exactly like personal development work, but I do so much extroverted feeling or harmony work in my day, like basically being a mom and owning a business and having clients. There's so many needs I have to meet for other people. I just need like a detox of like true introverted thinking time every day. And so I carve that out for myself and I communicate it. Hey, I'm gonna need to go play video games now. I just need to detox and get away from everybody and just get super into a space where I don't have to think about anybody's needs.
Well, and also gameplay puts you into a problem-solving, introverted thinking mode. I've got to solve this problem. I have to push this button sequence in the right order to get this accomplished task, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I mean, this is not like this is not me like really going into the advanced elements of introverted thinking, right? This is not like learning formal logic or debate or philosophy.
Yeah.
But it is something that gets me primed, and it is like a quick hit.
It's like a treadmill for your TI.
Yeah, exactly. And so I need that, and so I communicate that. And you have the same thing. You're like, hey, I need to go journal now. Like that's something that's going to happen. And so when you get really clear on what the needs of your auxiliary process are, then communicate it to your spouse. So most of the time people just want to know what's going on. If things are happening that they're not aware of, if something is happening outside of their frame of reference, if they think they're losing you somehow, most of the time they just need to know what's going on. So the clearer you can get around what the needs are that you have in your Copilot process, and the better you get at communicating it to the other person, not in a, well, you're not giving me this thing that I need, but more like, hey, I've recently discovered that I need this thing and I didn't know this before, and I'm letting you know so that you can help assist me in it, and then it's going to be fine. So the clearer you can get on that and communicate it, the better.
Yeah. So let's move down to the tertiary process, cognitive function, or 10-year-old if you're looking at the car model. And this is going to be in the same attitude as your driver process. So what I mean by attitude is if your driver process is extroverted, this process will also be extroverted. If your driver process is introverted, this process will be introverted. And what ends up happening is this is a very comfortable place for most people. In life, as we go through life, the reason why we skip past that Copilot or auxiliary or secondary process is because we're so comfortable being in the attitude of our driver. It puts us in flow so much. It's very easy to access that same attitude of that 10-year-old or tertiary process. So now, again, we talk about this as the maturity of a 10-year-old. Depending on your age and your maturity, 10's a rough figure. If you're like 90, maybe this is a little bit more mature than 10. But still, this is a place where you tend to go to that is not going to necessarily serve you the best, whether you're trying to see what's going on in the world, if it's a perceiving or learning process, or if you're trying to make decisions in the world, if it's a judging or decision-making process. It's going to show up roughly about the maturity level of a 10-year-old in your life. So our encouragement is you don't want to go here for the big stuff. If you're in a fight with your lover or spouse, it's probably not a good idea to be operating out of this part of your personality. It's going to probably not go well for you. However, if you are in a moment of playfulness or intimacy, well, who knows more about playfulness than children? And this can be a great part of engaging with your lover or spouse in a playful manner. This often can come up in the sexual experience. This can often come up in flirtation or playfulness, or when you're in a very fun, exciting, romantic dynamic. And you can pull on this process a lot to add spice and excitement and just a whole nother level of intimacy into your relationship. And your spouse or lover can do the same. So I think there's a lot of good stuff here. You want to be very careful that if you're trying to make decisions or learn information from this place, and it's a serious discussion about, your lives, your relationship, our recommendation is you don't go here first. You use this as a supplement to that auxiliary or Copilot process and your primary or driver, but you don't come here and rely on this to make adult decisions. That's not a good idea. But again, that playfulness piece I think is really big.
I agree. And I think the other piece here is, again, the assumption is that you have two diagrams in front of you side by side in the car model. And if you look at that car model and you see the driver and the 10-year-old, you see them kind of diagonal from each other. When you get stuck in this dynamic between the two of them in cahoots and the Copilot has been sort of ignored, that's called a loop. That's being in a loop. And even though loops in the grand scheme of things look similar from, between you and people of your same type, like you can describe an INFJ loop in a relative way or an ESFP loop in a relative way. Like they're going to kind of be similar. Like the loops are going to be similar because you're using the same functions to loop. But how we express them individually is based on us as people, right? Like this is, as an ENTP, I'm going to have an extroverted intuition, extroverted feeling loop. And it's going to kind of look similar to most ENTPs. But I also have life experiences that influence how my loop comes out. I know some ENTPs that get like super manipulative, like super emotionally manipulative when they're in a loop. I don't get emotionally manipulative. I just get angry. I like turn to rage. My extroverted feeling comes out as just like this big explosion of anger. and hostility and blame. And then I also get in loops when I'm feeling ashamed of myself because of my Enneagram type. I'm an Enneagram type 3, and so I feel lots of shame around that too. So how do you loop is a really good conversation to have. And if you look back at your behavior when you've behaved not well, you're probably going to start seeing a pattern of how your loop shows up. So just being able to know what your loop is and to know what your spouse is, how theirs shows up, again, it's more of an awareness exercise. And if you see each other in a loop, then you can help. I mean, not maybe in the moment, but once the heat has died down or whatever, the moment of tension is gone and you're both more in an open frame, you can talk about how you guys loop. What's my loop look like? What's your loop look like? What are we going to do to help prevent the loop from happening? What can I say during those moments that won't trigger you further and actually will help die the tension down a little bit. And you could provide the same service for me. Like what is the environment we need to create in order to keep us out of our loops? So just having that conversation, I think, is a big deal.
Yeah. And I think that tertiary or 10-year-old process is also the point of a lot of baffling conflict in relationship. You're like, why is this? You've been cool all day, and why are all of a sudden you upset with me? Or why is this all of a sudden a problem? And what I've noticed, a pattern in our relationship and other relationships I've observed and watched, is it's often that 10-year-old process that kicks in that's causing the trouble. And it's almost the 10-year-old needs to be like given a timeout or at least talked to and settled down.
Well, I think what it is that, and I think we've talked about this before in sort of an abstract, but the 10-year-old has to be, we call it being clean. I'm like, hey, is your TE, I mean, using the shorthand for extroverted thinking, because
effectiveness,
Joel's 10-year-old or tertiary process is extroverted thinking. I'll go, is your TE clean? And you'll ask me the same question. Is your FE okay? Like, is something going on? I think we don't recognize how anxious we get when our 10-year-old or tertiary process, it has something like an open loop or something bothering it. And it's because we can usually not worry about those things. Most of the time, I'd say like 90% of the time, if something would normally trigger a process like that, to the person who's got it as a 10-year-old as a tertiary, they're not even thinking about it. But then there's that 10% of the time where it really hits it like just right in the center of the target, like right bullseye. And then all of a sudden your 10-year-old tertiary is like, this has to happen right this second, or I can't even deal with it, or whatever it is. Like something's just really bothering that 10-year-old or tertiary process. And if that's happening, one of the first things you got to do is you got to cleanse it. You've got to go close the loop on whatever that is. And for me as an extroverted feeling person, I've noticed that when my house is dirty, I am just like generally in a bad mood. I'm just like in a bad mood because my FE, my extroverted feeling process, is just like, this is a mess. Why am I even bothering?
Yeah, and sometimes I'll go, like, I've learned this about you, and I'll say, you know what, maybe we should clean house today. And we'll like get up and clean house to get things settled. And like within 5 hours, you're like, I feel great. Everything feels wonderful. It's like, you were really mad this morning. What's going on? But it's that FE, that extroverted feeling harmony process that just needed to know that the needs of the household were being met.
Yeah.
And it needed to be settled down a little bit.
Yeah, I'm like, isn't the world a wonderful place? And I've noticed that even if it's a perceiving process, like let's pretend it's introverted intuition. How does introverted intuition not get clean? Well, if you're an ISP and your 10-year-old process is introverted intuition, you're probably pattern recognizing something that's not very nice. It might be something that you have some fear around or some paranoia, or maybe you are projecting on to somebody else maybe some ill intent or a bad opinion about you. If it's extroverted intuition, maybe you're catastrophizing. Or if it's, if it's introverted sensing, maybe you think that you're scared of the world outside. Like there are all different ways that 10-year-old or tertiary process shows up for us. And getting it clean is taking care of whatever is what is the icky feeling? What's the source of it? Why are you projecting onto other people ill intent? Or why do you think that the outside world is super scary and you just need to stay home? Like whatever it is, usually it's a matter of plugging the dike for a moment, like just getting whatever the fear is or the paranoia or the icky feeling, just kind of handling it to the best of your ability. And then of course it's going into your Copilot or auxiliary process to get you through the rest of the way. And so if you are an ISP, then it's getting back into a sensation experience or extroverted sensing, like reminding yourself that you have the ability to see what is happening in front of you and that it's going to probably be okay. But regardless of whatever it is, if you see your spouse, like for some reason, just bafflingly like being unable to be in a good mood or just triggered by everything or whatever it is, ask yourself, like, is something going on with that 10-year-old? Like, is there something unclean there? Is there something that's kind of untidy or needs to be cleaned up a little bit? And I mean, it's not the only reason why somebody would feel like not good, but it's one of the possibilities. So keep your finger on the pulse of that for yourself and for your spouse, and then go, hey, is there anything I can do to help you out with this thing? Let's go do something that makes that part of you feel good.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that this 10-year-old process is a great place to build intimacy and playfulness. And I've also observed that a lot of conflict, a high percentage of conflict in relationships comes from this place, comes from this 10-year-old process. Oftentimes, 2 10-year-old processes from 2 different people fighting with each other. And it's almost like 2 kids on the playground battling it out, and mom and dad need to step in and go, okay, guys, adults are in charge now. Let's settle down here and let's actually resolve this conflict. So, but what you need to remember is, out of conflict comes intimacy. Conflict can build incredible amounts of intimacy because you come to reconciliation, you find common ground, you find compromise, and you can build and you can find understanding, and you can build consensus and understanding and intimacy by playing with that to say, okay, I can see we're upset with each other, but man, as we work through this conflict, again, there's that intimacy piece this 10-year-old process can bring. And you move into that auxiliary or Copilot process, or even that primary driver process, and now you solve the problem that your 10-year-olds were fighting about. Oh man, you're starting to get more and more intimate and more in love and more in relationship with that person that you fell in love with originally. So don't fear the conflict there. Just understand what's going on. Put the adults back in charge in your personalities, and then resolve it and build even further intimacy with each other.
Yeah. I want to spend just a little bit more time on this part because I think it's so vital and crucial in a relationship. I think it's something that it's very easy to pass over, but this 10-year-old or tertiary process, like you said, can be the source of a lot of unconscious conflict. And I mentioned that if your driver process or that dominant process is a perceiving process for one person and a judging process for the other, that can kind of throw things off. But as a driver or dominant, but it can also do the same thing in that 10-year-old or tertiary process. If one person's, loop or getting stuck in that 10-year-old process, if it's perceiving, if it's a sensing or intuitive process, oftentimes it's a sense of avoidancy. Like, it doesn't want to necessarily make any decisions. It usually wants to avoid something that is very clear to maybe other people, but it doesn't like that evidence. It doesn't like that information. So it will either avoid information if it's introverted sensing or introverted intuition and kind of close itself off. Or if it's extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition, it'll just want to go distract itself somehow and go do something that doesn't want to think about it. If it's a judging process, a feeling or a thinking process, oftentimes it will show up by being resolute somehow and insistent that it's right in its own way. If it's an extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking process, like you and I are, oftentimes it's trying to push an agenda or trying to push a perspective and force the outside world to see it. But if it's an introverted feeling or introverted thinking, oftentimes it looks like just sticking your flag in the ground and being immovable, like you cannot budge me from this position. So depending upon what yours is and what your spouse's is, you might be fighting 2 different games. Let's say you're an like you're an EJ, so an ENTJ. And your 10-year-old process is extroverted sensing, but your spouse is maybe an INFJ. And so theirs is introverted thinking. So you're going to be avoidant by wanting to just distract yourself and not even think about it and just go do whatever, just keep busy, keep doing, keep like whatever it is that makes you avoid that information you don't want to see inside yourself. Whereas your spouse might be fighting the game of like sticking their pole in the ground and just being immovable. So now you have the old adage of the unstoppable force and the immovable object.
Yeah.
And neither the twain shall meet. Like that just creates a nuclear situation. So just being really aware of like how that 10-year-old process shows up for you as an individual and in your relationship, like really being clear on what is the tactic it takes inside the battle, if there is a battle between you and your spouse, being very aware of it, because you might unconsciously create for yourself a no-win situation and a zero-sum game where you have to win. Otherwise, like one person has to win and one person has to lose. And being really aware of the strategies your 10-year-old implements in those moments is, I think, just that awareness sort of tends to neuter the problem, but also it gives a platform for conversation between each other. Like, I have a tendency to just get really like stuck in my ways. I have a tendency to be avoidant. I have a tendency to just trying to push my will, or I have a tendency to hide out and hope it goes away. Like, whatever it is that your tactic is or your strategy is, be really clear and then communicate it to your spouse, going like, hey, if I'm doing this is probably what's going on for me.
Yeah. And I think that when I've noticed us in a mild battle or fight or disagreement, and we're both in that 10-year-old process, if one of us can get out of that, it usually helps bring the other one up. And sometimes it's hard because we're both stuck there. And I think when it's kind of like it's like almost now a personal development game, which person can get out of that first. We're kind of aware of it. And I think that's the key, is one of you, if you can get to that Copilot or even primary driver process, you can help pull the other person out of their tertiary 10-year-old as well. But one person has to make that leap. And sometimes that can be an ego hit. Sometimes that can be really tough to do. You feel like you're losing in the short term to pull out of being right or being correct or having your way or making your point or getting that thing done, whatever it is for you. It can be like you lost a little bit, but ultimately you're winning. You might be losing this battle. It feels like you're losing in the moment. I mean, it feels like this to me if I do this. I let go of like the thing that has to be done because my effectiveness process, that extroverted thinking, and my 10-year-old wants to get this thing accomplished. And I'm so adamant about it. And we're arguing about this has to happen. And there's reasons why it may not happen. And if I can pull myself out of that, I feel like I just lost. I feel like I just lost the game or the battle with you if we're like in an argument. And then ultimately I realize, well, it's not even like I won and beat you at it if I pull out of that. But what I did is I won for us. If I pull out of that, I didn't win for myself. I won for us. Like, I helped get myself to a place where now I can provide a space for you to get there. And you've done this for me too. You've gotten out of your process and provided a space for me to get there. And now it's not that one of us won the argument and one of us lost the argument. Both of us won the argument against the relationship getting hurt. Like, the relationship won in that situation. And I individually might feel like I lost. But man, I won something even more, which is intimacy. It's continuing the connection point, ultimately, of why I'm here with you in the first place. So I think this is something to remember. It's going to feel like an ego hit when you pull out of this, especially if you're the first one to do it. And even if you're the second one to do it, it can still feel like an ego hit because you want to hold on to that so tightly. And yet you've won. It's a winning position. It's not a losing position to be the first one to pull out of your strong held belief or situation or whatever it is that you want to put forth in the world.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to be fair, and probably last month, you've been in a much better space than I have because I've been kind of healing from some emotional stuff. And so, I mean, I've probably been creating a lot more problems and challenges and fights that are necessary. And you're almost always the first person, like in the last few weeks, to bring us out of that. And every time you do, I'm just like, oh man, I'm such a dipshit. And so you might feel like you're taking an ego hit, but as far as I'm concerned, as soon as you do it, I'm just like, ugh. Why why am I like this? And so even if it feels like you're taking that ego hit, the reality of the situation is it's very appreciated. And when you zoom out, you can tell like, no, the first person to man up, or not man up, but grow up and adult up, the first person to do that is the clear, like you said, they're doing it for the relationship. And how can you not appreciate that? So yeah. It does kind of sometimes feel like an ego hit, but it's not. Like you are definitely showing up as your best self when you are willing to do that.
So I think this tertiary 10-year-old process, just to really hit this point home, if you're going to look at all the parts of your car or the cognitive function stack, I think this is the one that you're going to probably be playing with the most, whether it's creating intimacy and playfulness or whether it's conflict resolution. This, for me at least, from my perspective, is the key to the whole situation, is what happens around this 10-year-old tertiary process. Now, everything else comes into play as well, but oftentimes, 90% of the time, this is where the trouble zone might show up for you. So that's something to really pay attention to. Focus in on what your 10-year-old tertiary process is and focus on your spouse or lover's 10-year-old tertiary process and just see some of the comparisons contrasting what it looks like for each of you. And then start to pay attention for when that shows up in your life. Now, the final cognitive function that we're going to talk about is the fourth position, your inferior process, or what we call in the CAR model, your 3-year-old process. Again, just like that 10-year-old, That mental process in you has a maturity of about 10 years old. And this process has about the maturity, this inferior process, has about the maturity of a 3-year-old. So it's like a little baby or toddler in the backseat of your personality. And it also, much like your driver, is something that's really not on your conscious awareness. If you look at your car model, on the left side of the car model, that driver and that 3-year-old, those are not as conscious as the auxiliary or Copilot and 10-year-old tertiary processes. Those are much more conscious for you. And because this is unconscious, because it's not a strength, it's the exact opposite cognitive function of your driver process, which puts you into flow. This is a process where there's a lot of, not wanting to be there much. It feels icky. There be dragons there. This is something that you just don't understand. You may not appreciate. It's something that feels very just weird or icky. And if it's described well to you, you're probably very turned off by this process, whatever yours is. So it's something to pay attention to because obviously it's a part of your personality, and your spouse or lover also has one of these as part of their personality. And if it's something unconscious that you also, when you are made aware of it, don't feel really good about it, it's kind of icky and you want to stay away from it, that can potentially cause conflict in your relationship, in particular when that process is needing to be relied upon in the relationship. Let me just give you an example. Let's say you are an ISTP in a relationship with an INFJ. An INFJ's Copilot, the way they make decisions, is extroverted feeling, harmony. An INFJ is probably going to be very good at social connection, understanding the tone of a room, at connecting with people. They're a feeler. They get that a lot of how people work and interact and the social dynamics. As an ISTP, that same process of harmony, that's a strength, it's in the auxiliary process for an INFJ, is going to be your inferior or 3-year-old process. So harmony is something that is unconscious for you. It's something that's not your strength. And when you're forced or required or pushed to go there, it's almost like you can't get away from that fast enough. And yet, this is the part where you're probably going to connect with your lover or spouse in a very intimate, heart-centric, feeler way. And here it's at your 3-year-old position. So already you can see, as an ISTP, you could feel at a disadvantage with the person that this is something that's a strength for them in some ways. Now you feel like, man, I'm at a disadvantage. I don't have that to show up. And when I do, I feel so silly and childlike, almost like a 3-year-old bumbling through this whole harmony process, this extroverted feeling. It feels like I'm in this alien world for myself. And I feel childish and silly, and I don't like it. And so you can maybe avoid it and stay in that introverted thinking process that's your strength or your driver. And here, maybe there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect in that that will help build intimacy and be there, but it's something so icky. So over time, maybe the INFJ you're married to or in relationship with builds trust, and you can open that part of you up. But it's something that you might need practice and a lot of space held for you as you go there. And the person you're in a relationship with might have to be patient. And if you're that INFJ with the ISTP, and you say, man, what is wrong with you? Why can't you just open up? Why don't you understand the social dynamics of this room? Why don't you understand my needs and getting them met? And you just don't understand why that person's not meeting your needs or coming at you in that heart-centric way. Well, it's just not a strength for them. And so you too will have to hold a lot of space and patience for that. Now, that's just one example that I just pulled off the top of my head. But you can see how that 3-year-old process can sometimes be a struggle for both parties depending on where it's at, or what it is, I should say.
Yeah, well, and taking that exact example one step further, once the trust has been built, if you are an ITP, an extroverted feeling or harmony is your 3-year-old, once the trust and intimacy has been built, the ever harming that piece of who you are is a massive betrayal.
It's like hitting a baby.
That's right. So one of the most important things to know about your spouse is what their 3-year-old or inferior process is, and to know that anytime you attack that piece of them, you are attacking the most vulnerable part of who they are. I've seen ETJs with introverted feeling or authenticity as a 3-year-old. A single betrayal can just destroy so much inside of them. And that follows through for pretty much everything. If you put your mate in a situation where their 3-year-old or baby process is exposed, and if you at all hurt that part of who they are, regardless of whether or not it seems like, as an ISFJ or an ISTJ, well, how would extroverted intuition be that part? Well, if you thrust them into a situation that requires them to, like you basically force a change that they're not ready for. You force them to make a massive life-altering change that they just have no preparation time to deal with it. That is a betrayal to them. There's a version of it for all 8 functions. And knowing what your spouse's 3-year-old or inferior process is, and knowing not to ever just whatever you have to do to not betray that piece of who they are, because that is that's one of the clumsy things that we unconsciously do to break intimacy with our spouse and lose a lot of trust. So that side-by-side comparison, really ask yourself, how does your 3-year-old show up for you? And what would be a massive betrayal for your 3-year-old? And then what's their 3-year-old and what would be a massive betrayal for theirs? And then just do what you can to honor that part of each other.
Yeah, and I think that this is unconscious. Sometimes spouses and lovers, they know this unconsciously. They may not even have the CAR model or cognitive functions, but they know what'll really hurt that person. They know exactly which button or which part of the heart to just push on. And oftentimes it's that 3-year-old process. So you also need to be mindful that you might think that, well, if I just push on this, I'll get my way or I'll win this argument or whatever. But you're thinking about the relationship, not just the 2 people, but how are you thinking about the relationship itself? You just hurt the relationship overall by maybe winning this little battle by picking at that 3-year-old. And man, you have really done some major damage. So it might work in the short term, but you're starting to break intimacy and be harmful to the other person when you push buttons like that, or you pick on it, or you expose it, or you don't help protect it. And they can feel like you're helping protect this part of them. Because this is think of a little toddler. This is something that's very baby-like and very childlike, and something that you want your spouse to protect just like you would protect it. I think it's really important to think about that. So I think that's the takeaway here is don't be very careful and don't be hurtful to this process. It could do a lot of damage really badly.
Yeah. On the flip side, in a more positive way, knowing what each other's inferior or 3-year-old process is a way for you to, kind of catch each other's blind spots. Something that's very, I think, one of the reasons why polarity creates attraction to some extent, especially when you look at cognitive functions, and why so many people who have they have like polar opposite processes end up together, like ESFJs and ISTPs, or ISFJs and ESTPs or whatever. Like the reason why that happens so often is because the other person has got your blind spot covered. Like they can handle those pieces and you'll handle the stuff for them. And if you're in a relationship like Joel and I, where we actually have the same dominant or driver process and the same inferior process, we're aware of that enough to go, okay, we need to create a system where neither of us deals with this, if at all possible. And then we have each other's back in that way too. So knowing each other's blind spot means that you will not be consciously hurtful, and you will do everything you can to, not weaponize against it, but also to try to protect it to some extent. And that is something that builds intimacy because the person can lean on you. They know that you've got their back, and they can rest into that. You will not harm that part that is exposed and vulnerable, but you'll also protect it. And not protect it in an unhealthy codependent way, but protect it in like an honoring that's just never going to be your strength sort of way.
I think so there's a couple pieces as we start to wrap up this show. A couple pieces of advice here. Obviously, if you are aware of this, that is like a huge step in helping build a better relationship for yourself and the person you're in a relationship with, or people you're in a relationship with. Understanding yourself, understanding how you're wired, understanding how you show up to the world, obviously is helpful. And then knowing the person that you're with, how they show up to the world. So sitting side by side, just awareness, just the information itself can be helpful to look at the 2 car models side by side and compare and contrast where you overlap, where the differences are, all those things we've just talked about. I think that's really key. And so that's the first step, I think, in all of this. If you want to take it another step further, you and your lover or spouse sit down and you begin to create the language and framework around your personalities. This is where you can start to use in conflict resolution, in accomplishing more intimacy, in building a better trust and relationship together by being able to speak to the cognitive functions themselves as they show up in relationships. So what do I mean by that? Well, in our relationship, Antonia and I, because we do this for a living and this is a part of our lexicon of understanding, we have a framework of the car model in our heads for ourselves and each other, and we will actually name and call out the cognitive process or function. Sounds really nerdy, right? But it's helped us a lot. We'll call out the process or cognitive function in the moment or in the conversation that we think is relevant. So let's say we're having an argument, or some kind of a disagreement about, well, I need to clean out the car because tomorrow we got to take it in to get it cleaned, and I got these other tasks to do, and I'm really anxious, and I'm really stressed out, and like, Antonia, you just booked this thing tonight for us to go do this social engagement, and here I got to clean this car out because it's got to be clean tomorrow, but I have all these other tasks, and now I can't do it, and I'm starting to go crazy. Antonia can look at me and go, hold it, okay. I think your effectiveness or 10-year-old extroverted thinking process is overwhelmed, Joel. I think this is that speaking from you right now. I think that's part of the personality that's riled up and upset in the moment. You feel like you need to close some loops in the tasks. I get it. I'll tell you what, why don't I clear this hour out? Why don't you go handle some of those tasks? Not the car necessarily, because that has to come after we come back from the party, but these other tasks will then put you at ease. So when we come back, you'll feel like you've got a handle on this. So she'll just call it out. I'll go, you're right. That is my extroverted thinking process, my effectiveness. I think you're right. And that brings me to a space of, okay, I can just get these things done here. And other times it's, Antonia might feel dysthymic or like she's in a bad mood. And I'm like, what's going on? And at first I go, is this your extroverted feeling? Is this harmony? Do you feel like the house needs to be clean? Or do you feel like people need something? No, that's not what's going on for me. I don't know what it is. And here it's winter time and we've been in the house for a month or two and there's been no external stimulation. I go, is your NE, your extroverted intuition or exploration driver? Do you need some stimulation and some excitement? And you go, maybe that would work. And then we try that and we can go out and get in a little adventure or something and make you feel better because you got to access your driver process. So it's this idea of using this as a framework for conversation to say, wait a minute here, I'm not attacking that 3-year-old process of yours and then you name what it is. I'm actually talking about this thing over here. And so it gives you this way for you and your lover or spouse to have conversations with a framework of what's going on for you. Now, again, we'll caution every hammer can be used to pound nails into walls or can be used to kill somebody or bludgeon someone to death. So by knowing this, you can't weaponize it with your spouse or lover. You can't be like, well, now that we know all these about ourselves, well, this is just your 10-year-old acting up in this process and blah, 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 blah. That's not going to be healthy. Again, that's not serving the relationship. That's going to just create discord and more division. The point is to use this for good, for building, not for tearing down.
Yeah, it's better to not use it at all than to use it as a weapon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is, and I think you'd agree with me. I think this has helped this is my second marriage. So I didn't have this framework in my first one, but having this framework now has helped so much from my perspective. I think you'd agree with this, Antonia.
Yeah, absolutely.
That just having the language alone solves like 90% of the conflict.
Yeah, it gives us shorthand to,
yeah.
And it kind of doesn't matter if it's empirically true.
Yeah, it's a philosophy, really.
But it kind of doesn't matter because it gives us language for what's going on. I'll just tell you, hey, my FE is totally fatigued. Like, I just cannot handle one more need. I just can't do it. I've just got to go be alone and not have to think that anybody needs me for anything. And you understand that. And you'll go, okay, I'll take care of Piper for about an hour. And I'm like, oh, thank goodness. Thank you. Or like you're just like, I'm done. My TE is overwhelmed. I can't even. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to grab Piper and we'll get out of your hair and you can just close loops to your heart's content. So it's it's like a way of communicating needs that just one short little shorthand, my FE, your TE, my whatever, like that just little shorthand gives a really fleshed out picture of what's going on for the person. And it gives us a language that allows us to quickly communicate needs going unmet to each other so that the other person can do what they can to help get those needs filled.
Yeah.
And I think it's been very powerful. So even if it's not true, it doesn't matter. Like it because it's so powerful, it's such a powerful way to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And so we highly recommend it. So what do you think? Are you in a pair bond relationship, and what's your car model and what's your spouse's car model? And are you seeing some of the things we're talking about? Has this been helpful to you to be able to determine and diagnose maybe some of the issues you've been experiencing and given you a little bit of language to be able to communicate to each other better ways of interacting and giving space to each other's, the natural parts of who you are and to be able to get some of those needs met?
If you take your relationship serious at all, my assignment to you is go do what we've told you to do in this episode. Go print out or look at, write down whatever you have to do, but look at the 2 car models and look at the comparing and contrasting of this. This is your assignment this week. And then come on to personalityhacker.com and let us know what you found out. Did you see similarities? Did you see differences? Where are the tension points? Are you starting to see patterns show up for you? Have you been aware of this before? And this just gave you even more language to go, oh, I knew this. I just didn't have language for the conflict. Now I have language. That's your assignment this week. I think that'll really help. It's the month of love. It's the month of relationships. We want to see you have an amazing relationship. So that's my assignment. That's my charge to you right now.
That's right. If you take your relationship seriously, you will obey us. We're going to just subtly start putting messages into all the podcasts that say obey. In fact, if you play our podcast backwards, it's just obey over and over and over again.
Is that what it says?
Yeah, obey.
That would be weird. I want to listen to one of our podcasts backwards. That would sound really weird, I bet.
That would be creepy. It would be very Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows what hidden messages are in there that are dropped? Who knows?
Absolutely. All right. Well, let us know how it went.
Yeah.
Drop a comment at the bottom of this podcast and let us know what's going on for you and your relationship.
Yeah. And if you want to join a community of like minds, very similar to you, interested in understanding themselves, interested in understanding how to be the best version of yourself, and you want to be a part of people that are interested in that too, come over to our community, facebook.com/personalityhacker, or you can join in twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you do us a huge favor, you can leave us a rating and review.
Yeah, we'd love that. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. See you then.